The instant Thaddeus Frank saw the Kremlin building show up on the TV screen, he pulled out a 20 and threw it on the bar beside his Heineken. "Sorry," he said to a passing bus girl. "I got someplace I have to be." And he grabbed his camera bag and ran out to the street. "LaGuardia," he told the driver, when he'd finally found a cab. He closed the car door, scrolled through his phone contacts, and hit the dial button. "So you're bugging out of here," the driver said. He was using his mirror to look at Thaddeus instead of watching for a chance to pull into traffic. "Yeah, I've got a real time crunch here, sorry." "Got it," the driver said, and adjusted his mirror. He'd been asleep when it had started. His ex-wife, of all people, had called him at 3:00 a.m. and screamed in his ear. Actually, that part wasn't so unusual. He'd already hung up by the time her words had sunk into his sleepy brain. "Turn on the TV!" Suddenly fully alert, he'd grabbed the remote from his nightstand and jabbed a button. The 60-inch flat screen on the wall was already split up and tuned to CNN, Al Jazeera, Fox News, and the Russian website Gazeta.ru. This time, they'd all carried the same footage, supposedly live, but nowhere near synchronous. He'd been relieved to see that the fuss was coming out of Beijing. It wasn't a local scoop he'd missed. When he'd seen what the story was, he'd laughed and called his ex a stupid bat and jabbed the remote again. It was an old hoax, and a dumb one, too, but it was just the sort of thing she'd fall for. He'd been asleep again in under a minute, but in the morning, Beijing was still celebrating. "You're sure you want to be flying?" the cabbie asked. "They might come here." "Yeah," said Thaddeus, "they might." When he got to Washington, they had the National Mall barricaded off. He got in with his press pass and set up his gear, a smart little director's chair, a down sleeping bag on a folding cot, a stash of cigarettes and self-heating cans of soup and coffee, and of course the camera on its tripod. 12 hours later, the mall looked very different. Military personnel and equipment were everywhere. A brass band in Marine uniforms was tuning up. A crew scrambled to set up a speaker's platform, and a small, dappled gray blob grew in the sky directly overhead. Thaddeus had turned his camera on every hour, 2 minutes before the hour all night, because in both Beijing and Moscow, the first appearance had happened exactly on the hour. And sure enough, at 7:00 a.m. to the very second, his camera had captured the very instant the fuzzy gray image appeared. He drank cold coffee, bought a breakfast sandwich from a vendor who must have had one hell of a security clearance, and watched history unfold. The brass band played God Bless America and left. The platform grew into a hulking mess of plywood and hardware before blossoming into something presidential. Tanks and rocket launchers and even a row of Revolutionary War-era cannons rolled in and lined up in pretty rows attended by people in sharp haircuts, braided ribbons, and enough brass buttons to make an extra flugelhorn for the band. "They look ridiculous, if you ask me," he mumbled to his camera. By 7:30, the fuzzy thing in the sky had become a cluster of 12 discs, and by 8:00 you could see with the naked eye that they were not really discs but 12-sided objects. By 10:00 they filled the sky, and by 11:00 only the central one could be seen from where Thaddeus sat on his director's chair. An army platoon marched in and took up residence only a couple of yards from him, in dress uniforms and shiny shoes and hats that Thaddeus figured must have been designed to kill the enemy with laughter. Their weapons looked out of place with the dressy clothes. 36 rifles, as near as he could see, and a portable anti-tank rocket launcher. The president showed up, but Thaddeus couldn't get a clear view, so he had to give up and let another photographer handle it. He checked his main camera and adjusted the angle again. The object above had long ago grown too large to fit in the frame, so he'd chosen a feature based on what he'd seen from Beijing and was filming that. If his hunch was right, that feature was a hatch, and if he was lucky, that hatch would eventually open. The corporal holding the rocket launcher didn't look like he was feeling lucky. Maybe it was just that the launcher was heavy, but there seemed to be more to it than that. The young man looked scared. Thaddeus grabbed a second camera from his bag, secured it to one of the auxiliary mounts on the tripod, and discreetly turned it on the corporal, whose name tag identified him as Coleman. A moment later, its feed was streaming live to the major networks along with the feed from his main camera. Technicians at the studios would decide which feed to pull from, either of Thaddeus's or someone else's at any given moment. The corporal's fear wasn't all that unusual, Thaddeus knew. Millions of Americans were probably spending this historic morning hanging their heads over toilets and trash cans and storm drains. Emergency rooms were doubtless overflowing with patients suffering from everything from heart attacks to hives. Thaddeus shook his head. He would never understand the human propensity for irrational fear. If this had been the first landing, he would have understood. If this landing had shown any signs of being different from the other two, he would have understood then, too. But so far, at least, what was happening here in Washington was exactly the same as what had happened in Beijing and Moscow. It had all started when a blurry object had appeared in the sky directly over the city. Over time, it had come close enough to come into focus as 12 separate objects. More time, and the objects had proven to be so mind-bogglingly huge that only the central one could be seen from any point in the city. If the pattern continued, and Thaddeus would be very surprised if it didn't, the huge objects would eventually stop descending. A hatch would open on its vast, smooth belly, and 12 large ships would emerge and hover in the same formation as the first 12 objects. Out of the central ship would come something surprisingly similar to one of NASA's old space shuttles. The shuttle would land, and a man or woman who looked a little bit like a crocodile would step out and address the crowd in excellent but accented English. And Thaddeus was lucky enough to be here, right in the middle of the most important event in American history since the corn goddess had created the first humans, or however that story went. He supposed he ought to put a little more effort into keeping his mythology straight, but there was always something in the present to occupy his mind, so he never got around to it. Events continued to unfold exactly as they had in Beijing and Moscow, but that didn't seem to calm Corporal Coleman any. He passed the rocket launcher to his neighbor, a Private Di Benedetto, and stood there steadily turning greener. By the time the space shuttle emerged from its ship, Corporal Coleman had the launcher again and had changed from green to an unnatural white. Thaddeus wondered if he could manage to keep holding the thing when he seemed to be on the verge of passing out. From the size of it, it must have been heavy. Thaddeus carefully kept the shuttle in the main camera's frame as it landed, but left the other one focused on Corporal Coleman. Over the years, he'd learned that the human side of a story was sometimes just as important as the actual events. At 4 seconds past 11:57 a.m., the shuttle door opened, and, true to the pattern, a single figure began to step out. And Corporal Coleman fired. A blast of flame shot out behind him as the rocket came out of its launching tube and zoomed into the sky. The visitor from the shuttle stepped onto the grass, glanced at the celebratory projectile, then settled his gaze on the president and began to walk toward him. The rocket flew directly over the visitor, turned, and shot straight down, erupting in a fireball that engulfed the shuttle. When the flames were finally extinguished, the visitor's charred corpse was spread in small pieces across the blast zone.